Good evening and welcome to the Brian Crombie Radio Hour on Saga 960. I've had the pleasure of chatting with Honorable Hugh Segel before, former member of the Senate of Canada, former principal secretary to Brian Mulroney, advisor to John Tory, advisor to numerous different politicians over the year. And I think probably best known not only for his Brian Mulroney time, but also in working with Bill Davis, was it not?
That's right. It was a great privilege for me to be both his legislative secretary and then after a few years, his associate cabinet secretary for federal provincial relations. The happiest time in my life.
What an incredible experience you've had, sir. So one of the issues that I understand you're passionate about is a guaranteed annual income. And I guess because of CERB, we've sort of had a little bit of experience with it over the course of the last couple of months. Not really a guaranteed annual income, but maybe close to it. And some people think that maybe one of the demands the NDP puts on the Liberals to support them in the upcoming throne speech. So I wonder if you could tell us a little bit about a guaranteed annual income, how you would construct it, and why you think it's such a great idea.
Sure, Brian. I'm glad for the opportunity. But let's start with where we are now. If you're one of the 3.5 million Canadians who live beneath the poverty line, which is a little bit less than 10% of our population, the only support available for you now is either provincial welfare, which is run by the provinces, on which they spend, by the way, $30 billion a year, or if you don't get that, you're part of the other half of the 3 million people who are the working poor. And the working poor are people who work. More than half of the people who live beneath the poverty line in Canada have a job, but they don't earn enough from that job to get over the poverty line, which is measured by the federal government by something called the market basket test. And the market basket test, market basket measure, basically says, here's what it costs in Toronto or in Fredericton or in Skeena to pay for your rent, to pay for food, to pay for transportation, to pay for clothes. And that constitutes the market basket measurement of what somebody needs not to be living in poverty. So as we speak, there are 3 million Canadians living beneath that number all across the country. And the problem with that system is that for those who work, and a majority of them do, they don't earn enough from any one job. They usually are part-time. It usually comes with no benefits like sick leave. So if you think about what we've just gone through for the first part of the pandemic here in Canada, a lot of the tragedies that took place in the long-term care homes took place because the employees were largely in that working poor category. They weren't being paid enough, they didn't get benefits, so many of them had to hold down more than one job to try and make a living. And as they moved from long-term care place to long-term care place, they became the innocent vectors of the virus. And that's why part of the reasons we had such a tragic outcome by compared to other countries in our long-term care homes right across Canada. So the issue is, can we do that better than we're now doing it? That's the question.
So give me a sense, if you could.
I'm sorry?
Give me a sense, if you could, that market basket test. Any idea what it would be in like the Greater Toronto area right now?
Yeah, in the Greater Toronto area, it would be something like about $1,200 to $1,300 a month. In other words, you're not going to live with any great comfort at $1,200 or $1,300 a month.
So $24,000 to $27,000 a year.
But if you live beneath that number, you're living in poverty.
Right.
Which means you do not have enough money in any one month to cover food, rent, clothing, heat, and public transportation. And you know, many of the essential workers that we have been so grateful to and celebrating because they've been the ones out working in the supermarkets and working elsewhere fall into that category. And so we have to ask ourselves, a country as wealthy as Canada, do we have the capacity to do that better? And I've always been of the view that the problem with welfare, as it exists in every province, is that A, welfare only pays every recipient half or less of the market basket test, right? Half or less of what's actually necessary. And worse, most of the welfare rules across Canada say to the recipients, if you work, because you want to earn a bit more money and you want to do a little better for your family, the minute you earn more than a couple of $100 a month, we're going to tax that back at a dollar for dollar.
100%.
Which is a higher rate of tax on earned income than the wealthiest Canadians now pay. So clearly we have something fundamentally wrong with the system as it now operates. And for many, many years, there's been a whole group of people who've been of the view that we can do this more efficiently and with more humanity, less stigma. So the notion of a basic income or a guaranteed income, whatever one wants to call it, is very simply what we now do for our seniors. So in Canada, senior citizens, once they're over 65, get the guaranteed income supplement. What does that mean? It means that if for any reason a senior citizen from all their different sources does not earn $1,500 a month, they get topped up automatically by the federal government to get to $1,500 a month. Now, a lot of senior citizens do better than that, which is great, but there are many who, in fact, don't, and they get topped up. And when Bill Davis brought this in to begin with provincially, back in 1975, and by the way, in a minority government, we took the rate of poverty among senior citizens, which was 35%. 35% of Ontario senior citizens in 1975 were living beneath the poverty line. And that was because many of them happened to be women, the men passed on earlier, and they really weren't getting any meaningful income with which to live. When Davis brought in the basic income, was called the Guaranteed Income Supplement, Guaranteed Annual Income Supplement, that rate of poverty in Ontario amongst seniors was reduced from 35% to 5% in 3 years. So we know how to do this. This is not rocket science. This is not something that has to be designed in a lab. We have done this before, and the federal government, to their credit, took that over with the Guaranteed Income Supplement, which now goes right across the board to all seniors in Canada. It's a basic guarantee of what they need. It's always struck me that we could be doing this for those between the ages of 18 and 64. We now have, to be fair to the federal government, they have a child benefit, which is very helpful to middle and low income families with kids. Generates a fair amount of income, which keeps them above the poverty line. I give the federal government full credit for that. This government, the Trudeau government, did that. But for people between 18 and 64 who don't have children and who are underemployed or not earning enough or falling beneath the poverty line, we have nothing. There's no federal program at all to help them. Now, I hear that the government of Canada is thinking about changing the employment insurance rules to make it easier for people who work on a project basis or people who work who are gig employees, etc., to get some benefits. But if you don't mind my saying so, saying you're going to fix employment insurance when we know 3 million Canadians are living in poverty is like saying, I know there's a fire in the basement, but by golly, I'm going to paint the roof. And that's the problem with that approach. And let's be clear, we've been seeing all the understandable anti-racist demonstrations and Black Lives Matter and all of that across North America. The largest group of people who live beneath the poverty line in Canada are Black, Indigenous, and people of color. That's who they are in terms of the largest groups. And if you look at a map of Toronto, which we have seen in various publications, where did the COVID hit worse? Where were the highest levels of infection? It wasn't in the center of the city or in the relatively ritzy suburbs where folks were doing okay. It was in those parts of town where the income levels were the lowest. And of course, when people get sick because their health is not the same as those who live above the poverty line. We know, by the way, and Women's College Hospital has done great work on this, poverty is a perfect predictor of bad health outcomes. Set aside COVID, unrelated to COVID. People who live in poverty get chronic illnesses sooner, they go to hospital more quickly, they stay in hospital longer, and they live between 8 to 10 years shorter lives than the rest of us. And I don't recall a meeting of any political party where it was agreed that 10% of my population should die 10 years younger because they're poor. I don't recall that resolution ever being proposed or passed. So the question is, can we do it better? And I believe a guaranteed income would work well. Let me give you an example of what we've learned. Good.
Let me interrupt you just for a second. We're going to take a break, and we're going to come back and ask you for that example. We're chatting with the Honorable Hugh Segel, former senator in the Senate of Canada, former advisor to numerous different politicians, who's telling us about a guaranteed annual income. We're going to take a quick break for messages, and stay with us. We're going to come right back in just a second. Welcome back to the Brian Crombie Radio Hour, Saga 960. We're chatting tonight with Honorable Hugh Segel, former advisors to Brian Mulroney, Prime Minister Brian Mulroney, Premier Bill Davis, John Tory, amongst many others, and someone who I think has seen it all: provincial politics, federal politics, international issues, economic issues, and social issues. And Mr. Segel, I apologize, I interrupted you. You were just going to give me an example of how it works.
Well, what we found during the early days of the pandemic, when 8 million Canadians lost their jobs one morning, not because they didn't want to work, but because the governments across Canada closed down the economy to protect everybody in terms of the public health requirements of the COVID virus threat. The federal government brought in the SERVE program, and it wasn't about filling out thousands of forms, and it wasn't about meeting with your caseworker for 3 weeks to see whether you're deserving. You filed on your CRA account, and believe it or not, in many parts of Canada, if they filed on a Monday, the money was in their bank account by Wednesday. So that shows that we can do this. We have the capacity. The hardworking people at CRA know how to do this, and they do it really, really well. So that suggests that we would be far better off than the existing endlessly bureaucratic welfare system to have an automatic process whereby if your income falls beneath the definition of poverty, then you're automatically topped up from CRA to a number that's decided upon by government that would get you out of poverty and give you a chance not only to survive, but also encourage you to work, because under the guaranteed income plan, you would not have your earnings taxed back dollar for dollar. You'd be encouraged to go out and earn and improve your family circumstances, a vast majority of Canadians want to do. And then when you began to get taxable income, it would be taxed at the same level as the rest of us. And that is one of the ways that the guaranteed income will begin to pay for itself. Because the ultimate victory is to make the guaranteed income proposition obsolete, because people do find work. They are healthier. They integrate with the workplace, and the amount of people who are dependent upon that was reduced over time. And we know that the pathologies of poverty are very costly to our healthcare system. I'm talking to you from my home in Kingston tonight. We have 6 federal and provincial prisons within 50 miles of the downtown of Kingston. 80% of what I like to refer to as the guests of Her Majesty in those prisons come from the 10% of the population who live beneath the poverty line.
80% of those prison inmates come from 10% of the population that are impoverished.
You think about what that means in terms of the cost of the process. You think about what that means in terms of how that money might be better spent if there are less people living in poverty, more gainfully involved in the economy, and therefore less need for all that prison and penal system which we've had in Canada for a long time. So there are many benefits and savings, not to mention the provinces who now have to pay $30 billion a year for their welfare programs, provincial welfare programs. Once the federal program came in, they could redirect that $30 billion somewhere else. They could invest in better long-term care facilities. They could invest in helping the disabled or people on the autism spectrum. A whole bunch of things they could do, which they now claim they can't do because of the cost structure that they face. So I really believe that a basic income would, first of all, promote work and efficiency. Secondly, it would not be about stigma. Thirdly, it would reduce the need for excessive bureaucracy. And finally, it would produce a context where there's room at the family table for everybody who wants to put their shoulder to the wheel and do their fair share.
The biggest criticism that I've heard is that there's a disincentive to work, that people on CERB, people on a guaranteed annual income, whatever you might call it, would just stay home and enjoy the check that comes in from the federal government.
So Brian, every test that's been done, there was a pilot project done for 3.5 years in Dauphin, Manitoba in the mid-70s. There's now a project being done in Stockton, California. There have been projects done in Finland and in 3 cities in the Netherlands. And in no circumstance do the people who are eligible for the top-up stop working. In fact, they want to work, and the only reason they get the top-up is because they're not earning enough to get above the line. And the top-up gives them a measure of freedom in life about, for example, when we did the test in Ontario, the basic income pilot in Ontario, there were 3 cities, Hamilton, Thunder Bay, and Peterborough, Lindsay. And in those cases, here's what those people who had low incomes and who were topped up did with the extra money. Some went back to school to get a better education because they knew if they got a better education, they'd get a better job. Some used the money to move to a better part of town so their kids could be in better schools. 1 or 2, I remember I talked with people in Lindsay who used the money to start a small entrepreneurial business, which they could not otherwise have been able to do. But rather than being forced to work at low-paying poverty wages for employers who don't want to pay a living wage, offer no benefits, they actually had choices in their life just like the rest of us do. And I think that would make our society more productive. There'd be more growth in the labor force, not reduction. And the evidence of people who would, sit on the couch, eat chocolates, and watch soap operas, there's no evidence to suggest that those numbers are in any way meaningful at all.
Even though we've all probably heard stories about restaurants that can't attract back employees or other companies right now that are having challenges getting their employees to come back to work because you might as well just stay at home and get the CERB.
Well, the question is, what were those organizations paying to begin with? I noticed, as you will have noticed, that the big supermarkets offered a $2 an hour increase to the people who were working at the beginning of the pandemic in the store, stocking the shelves and doing all of that good stuff. And then when things leveled out, they took the $2 back. Now, we're not dealing with companies here who don't understand how profitable the business is because they're in it. We're dealing with companies who are saying if they can get it for cheaper, then why don't we get it for cheaper? And when people get jobs that do not pay any basic benefits and are part-time and are poverty wages, that weakens all of society in every aspect of our economy.
So let's talk about long-term care. You indicated it as one of the examples that it has been a tragedy during COVID-19. I've had several people on my show that talk about how after SARS, there were numerous studies that were done, in fact, a judicial inquiry in Ontario that said one of the problem was exactly what you're indicating, was that it was temporary workers that were very low paid, that to make a regular income had to take jobs in numerous different long-term care facilities. And they were, personal care workers that were going back and forth between 2 and 3 different long-term care facilities. And then what happened, as we've seen, is that those long-term care workers had to keep their jobs, had to keep working, and went back and forth between different long-term care facilities and took the virus from one place to another place. So in that regard, isn't the better solution than a guaranteed annual income, frankly, regulation that ensures that they get paid an appropriate wage and don't have to take jobs at numerous different long-term care facilities. And in fact, the judicial inquiry after SARS said full-time employees were the solution to ensure that viruses didn't go from one long-term care facility to another one.
You're absolutely right about that. And it didn't happen because various governments of different political affiliations in Ontario did not enforce the findings of that report. And here's the problem. The problem we have is a demand for these facilities wildly exceeds supply. And the province doesn't want to spend its own money building these facilities, so they're glad to let the private sector do it. Some private sector providers are very competent, do a good job, not all. And the ones who don't are the ones where we have seen the kind of problem that we saw during this process. So it's not only tying up the regulatory frame, it's also about looking at the model. Is the model for older people that they have to go into some kind of institutional setting? Now, there are people who are impaired, there are people who have Alzheimer's and other problems, and that's a very specific challenge we have to step up to. But the notion that we could not be providing some better service for folks at home, Dr. Sinha, who's the head of the federal government's Senior and Aging Advisory Council, has said, and he's head of gerontology at Mount Sinai, that we could be investing in home care and get much better bang for our buck. And the vast majority of people who live in their homes as long as possible live longer. The numbers are clear in that respect. So we should be asking ourselves two questions. What do we do to make sure that people are paid properly when they work in those homes? Your point is absolutely well taken. And secondly, is the model of the homes being the only answer the universal proposition going forward? Or do we have to have a slightly more variable approach based on the needs and capacities in the community?
We're chatting tonight with the Honorable Hugh Segel, former advisor to numerous different political people over the last half a century, if not longer. We're going to take a break for some messages and come back with Mr. Segel in just a minute. Stay with us. Well, welcome back. We're chatting tonight with the Honorable Hugh Segel, formerly of the Senate of Canada, former advisors to Prime Minister Brian Mulroney, Principal Secretary to Premier Bill Davis, advisor to John Tory, active within the conservative, progressive conservative, whatever party over numerous different years, and a voice of reason within the Canadian political spectrum for numerous different years, and someone who I've followed over the years. Mr. Segel, Honorable Mr. Segel, in the 1980s, the Macdonald Royal Commission went across Canada, produced 26 volumes of their report, and recommended, number one, a free trade agreement between Canada and the United States. Yep. Number two, a guaranteed annual income. Right. Number three, a negative income tax structure. And number four, transitional adjustment assistance so that people wouldn't be hurt by the new globalization. The Prime Minister that you worked for at the time took one of those recommendations, free trade, and implemented it, and didn't implement the rest. Was that the right decision?
Well, what he did with the other ones, the economic recommendations beyond free trade, is that he gave it to a blue chip group of folks in Quebec, the Conseil de Patronat, which is kind of like the Council of Chief Executive Officers. And they responded that there was no need to do those transitional things because unemployment insurance would cover any risk that any difficulties in the job market generated by free trade might occasion. And then what happened was that various governments then reduced the level of unemployment insurance that was available to Canadians. So as you and I sit here and chat about this, understand 40% of the people who are out of work in Canada are not covered by employment insurance, 40%. So those people, either because they were part-time employees, didn't have enough hours booked for the purposes of eligibility, they're gig employees, they work on projects, whatever, they're not covered. So those people end up, when they're in difficulty, only being able to get support from welfare. By the way, the level of welfare support has been cut. by governments of different affiliations. Craychank cut employment insurance numbers by raising the eligibility requirements. Mike Harris cut the welfare numbers. And so you now have a circumstance where there's a lot of people amongst that 3 million who are living on very, very meager resources and end up in difficulty in a whole bunch of ways that often involve substance abuse and the police and healthcare. There's a wonderful story about what's referred to as the $1,000 soup and sandwich at St. Mike's, which is a wonderful hospital right in the middle of Toronto. And I owe them so much because when I was ill, they were of great value to me, as they are to so many other patients. When someone wanders into the emergency ward at St. Mike's, suffering from a chronic circumstance, and their disposition suggests they're not amongst the wealthiest part of our society, they get triaged by the medical staff in the emergency room. They're sorted out, and if they need a prescription or whatever, it's addressed. But then St. Mike's has said, you know what, we really shouldn't have sent this fellow back onto the street without a hot bowl of soup and a sandwich. And the cost of that hot bowl of soup and a sandwich is $1,007. The soup and sandwich is $7. But the triage that brought him in to the emergency ward to be assessed and analyzed in terms of what his challenges were, that cost us all $1,000. So the costs of poverty are not just borne by the people whose lives are made more miserable by living in poverty and their family and kids and neighbors and community, but by all of us as taxpayers. So that's another incentive to get this right and to not leave things the way they now are.
Can you explain the negative income tax, or the way that you described it earlier about that the tax rate for someone that was on the guaranteed annual income or on welfare and started working had 100% dollar for dollar of their income tax back, and how you think the structure should work?
So, Brian, the negative income tax is another way of expressing a term that's called a refundable tax credit. So, in our economy now, a whole bunch of folks get tax credits for good reasons. They set up an RRSP. They make an investment in technology. There's a whole bunch of good reasons to get tax credits. But you basically have to have money, i.e. you have to file your income tax and show income before you can benefit from the tax credit. So for people who have no money, what they bring in is something called a refundable tax credit, which means no matter how much you make, if you meet the following criteria, you will get that tax credit delivered to you automatically, deposited in your account by CRA. When I was teaching at Queen's some years ago, I used to say to my graduate students, around the end of March, I hope you guys and gals are going to be filing your taxes. And they would say, well, why? We don't have any money. Yeah, we're students. I said, that's right. That's exactly why you should file your taxes. Because when the GST was brought in by the Mulroney government, they brought in the GST tax credit, which meant that if your income, for whatever reason, was not above $30,000 a year, you would get a refundable tax credit deposited into your account every quarter so that you weren't paying too much of your limited income in sales tax. And that worked and has been there for a long time. So we have that in our system now. Would not be hard. People file their taxes. We all have to file our taxes under the law. And if your income falls beneath a certain level, then based on the statute, if it's passed, the law, you would get a refundable tax credit or a negative income tax, so the money comes out to you to give you some liquidity. And whether that is done on a monthly basis or a quarterly basis is something that we would have to sort out when the legislation went to Parliament.
You said that poverty and bad outcomes from health are correlated. Can you explain that?
Yes. Some tremendous work was done by Dr. Andrea Martin, who's the head of research at the Women's College Hospital, based on her own urban practice. And basically what she found was that when people didn't have enough money to live in reasonably okay housing, not fancy, but okay, and eat a reasonable diet, they were susceptible to any bug that was around. They would get the bug sooner. They would get sicker from it, rather than people who have good housing and who are eating properly. So there's a relationship between your ability to do that financially and your ability to resist not just the COVID, but all the infections that we face on a regular basis in the Canadian winter. So the numbers are clear. There's a large literature. If your listeners Google the social determinants of health, they'll see a huge literature on studies that have been done for decades on why low-income people have less constructive health outcomes, get sick sooner, have larger problems with heart condition and blood pressure and diabetes and all the rest than those who are in better shape because of their inability, for lack of money, to eat properly, to get the level of exercise they need, and to live in a space which in and of itself will not be breeding mold and a whole bunch of other problems. So there's evidence on that now right around the world. It's not new, it's been there for a long time. So we know that. And the question becomes, if we know that, why wouldn't we be investing in reducing the amount of people who live in poverty so as to get better health outcomes? Because what we know is that if you wander into the emergency ward of any Canadian hospital in a normal day, the majority of people sitting in that emergency ward have not had a serious trauma, thank goodness, but they're there because some disease has acted up in a way where they have to go to emergency, but because, by the way, they had nowhere else to go. And the vast majority of those people would be people who live beneath the poverty line. So that produces a huge cost burden that we all share through our universal health insurance. And that becomes part of what we pay extra because we're not prepared to invest in reducing poverty at the outset.
So COVID-19 appears to have dramatically impacted negatively Black Americans, Black Canadians, African Canadians. Is that the same issue that you're talking about?
Absolutely. And I'll give you a wonderful quotation from Martin Luther King. When Lyndon Baines Johnson in the 1960s signed the Voter Rights Act, which was a huge step ahead for democracy in the United States, Martin Luther King said, it didn't cost the white majority much for President Johnson to give Black Americans the legal right to vote universally across America. But what will cost more is when we deal with the other part of discrimination, which is the poverty in which a huge part of Black Americans, Americans of color, Indigenous and others here in Canada live all the time. That will cost money. That is an important investment. And I believe that if we don't make that investment there, we'll be facing much higher costs in every other aspect of our society because the amount of difficulty that poverty produces for folks will generate huge demand on the healthcare system, the penal system, the judicial system, and will produce bad outcomes in our schools. I mean, here in Kingston, now Kingston is not the wealthiest town in the world, but it's kind of a middle class operation and people get by okay. We have 3,000 children who have to get a free breakfast every morning because there's no breakfast at their home. And the community organizations and Rotary and a whole bunch of others do a great job in providing that. But the reason they do that is because teachers say when someone comes to class who hasn't had breakfast, his or her ability to learn and make progress in school is pretty diminished by comparison to the others. And that, of course, affects that young person's prospects for a better life, a better job, further education, and the same level of satisfaction out of their life that we would like all our young people to be able to aspire to and achieve.
What you're arguing for seems to make a lot of sense. Economically, it seems to make a lot of sense, as well as ethically, it seems to make a lot of sense. But governments haven't chosen to do that. In the United States, one of the reasons that sometimes people use for why the majority of Americans don't want to provide healthcare as a universal right to all is that the people that don't have that healthcare today are primarily Black, and that therefore there is a bit of racism in the lack of willingness to provide economic benefits to African Americans. And part of it also is this sense that that they didn't work for it, so they don't deserve it. So it's a a desire that you don't get a free gift.
No free lunch, right?
No free lunch. Is that playing out in Canada? Are people worried that, you know, if your statistic is right, that so many of the people that are in poverty are African Canadians, and do you think racism is playing a role in why we don't want to provide a guaranteed annual income, or is it this desire to not give a free lunch?
Well, it's probably a little bit of both, but there's some very different qualities to Canadian society versus American society. The founding principles of the American Constitution are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, which is kind of what they live by, and I give them nothing but credit for it. Our founding principles are peace, order, and good government. Now, I'm not saying ours is better than theirs, but I'm saying ours is different, which is why in the 60s, a new Democratic Party, CCF, Premier of Saskatchewan, could bring in universal health insurance. And by the way, the doctors and others fought tooth and nail against it. It wasn't easy. It brought in a conservative prime minister, also from Saskatchewan, Mr. Diefenbaker. So I wonder what this means for Canada, and got Mr. Justice Emmett Hall, a former distinguished member of the Supreme Court, to do an analysis. And Hall's report said, doable, affordable, necessary. That report never went to Diefenbaker because he was defeated by Mike Pearson in 1963, but that report went to Mike Pearson. And Prime Minister Pearson, to his credit, worked with all the provinces, different political affiliations, to bring in a national universal health insurance program. And whatever the controversies were back in the 60s, it is now the third rail of Canadian politics. Nobody will go against universal health insurance. It's fundamental to the way in which we live our life. So that says to me that there's more of a will in Canada to get beyond petty matters of racism and, you know, who's getting a free lunch, and look at, frankly, how we make society such that equality of opportunity is real. I don't believe in equality of outcome. Our socialist friends believe in equality of outcome, and good luck to them. I believe in equality of opportunity. Everybody gets a shot at a basic education, at good health care, and then if they work hard, then they do well. And they may do better than their neighbor. And the tax system should recover from those who do better, enough to help us finance the whole system overall. And I'm okay with that. I think most Canadians are. And I think the problem has been three opponents, groups of opponents to the basic income. Group one, civil servants who do not like a statutory requirement to send out money to anybody. Why? Because if they work in the Department of Finance, they believe their job is to preserve the spending discretion of their minister and their government. And every automatic payout program like OHIP in Ontario reduces that discretion. The second group are the far right, who really do believe that if you pay people who are not working, they'll never want to work. They mean well. I'm not suggesting they're bad people. They believe that. No evidence to back that up at all in any of the 34 places in the world where the basic income has been tried. And the other group, frankly, is on the far left. People on the far left say, you know what? Milton Friedman was once in favor of this. Bob Stanfield was once in favor of this. Mr. Churchill was once in favor of this, so it can't be good because all those conservatives think it's a good idea. And they truly believe that if you design programs run by thoughtful public servants, well paid, for all members of the public service unions, by the way, that's the best way to serve the poor. And the poor will accommodate themselves to the programs designed by the swells. To which my response is, that's the classic definition of colonialism. One group of people decide how other people will live their lives, rather than giving people the basic amount so they can live their lives and make some of their own choices, not as much as the rest of us, but at least in some way similar to what the rest of society gets to do. And I think that would make Canada more productive. It would increase the workforce. It would increase the economic viability. Look, the federal government in this last crisis provided huge liquidity for financial markets and banks and large institutions, and I give them full credit for that through the Bank of Canada. The Federal Reserve did the same. We have liquidity for the big guys. When it comes to little guys who are in trouble through no fault of their own, all of a sudden we have all these moral questions to ask. I don't think that holds water.
We're chatting tonight with the Honorable Hugh Segel about a guaranteed annual income. We're going to take a final break and come back with some concluding comments. Stay with us. Well, welcome back to the Brian Crombie Radio Hour. We've been chatting, what a fascinating conversation, with the Honorable Hugh Segel, former senator in the Senate of Canada, former advisors to Prime Minister Brian Mulroney, to Bill Davis, Premier Bill Davis, to John Tory, to numerous different people. Mr. Segel, let's talk about the politics in our last few minutes, if we could. We've got a throne speech coming up. The NDP are going to be probably the people that decide whether the government stays or not. The Bloc have announced that they're going to vote no confidence in the government because of the wheat controversy. The Conservatives, with their new leader, unquestionably are going to be voting against the government. Some people think that a guaranteed annual income along the lines of CERB is going to be the deal between the NDP and the Liberals to make it all work. What do you think?
Well, I don't know what will be in any proposal made by the NDP, but I will say this. The NDP has been in favor of the basic income for a long time. The Green Party has had it as part of their platform for over a decade. The Bloc Québécois, of course, the Parti Québécois in Quebec, the provincial government brought in a basic income law when they were in government. They didn't put enough money in to make it real, but they did. So there is a consensus there. And when I hear the Prime Minister saying we have to think about a new way to provide for better equality of opportunity in our society and more fairness, there are reasons for optimism. And by the way, I would argue that if you listen to what Aaron O'Toole has been saying he's not looking for an election. He's looking for a way to help the government rebuild the economy in a way that's constructive. And he's prepared for an election if it happens, but that's not what he's looking for. And I think he's being actually quite sincere in that respect. And the notion that the federal government might bring in a reform to welfare in a way that promoted work and promoted greater economic productivity and reduced the amount of people living in poverty is not something that I would think would be rejected out of hand by any of the other political parties. So the question is whether the Prime Minister and our new Minister of Finance will have the intestinal fortitude to proceed down that road. I'm hopeful they will, but I have no reason to know one way or the other.
Well, Honorable Hugh Segel, it's a pleasure and an honor to speak with you tonight. Thank you so much for joining us. I have followed your career with great interest over the years. I think I mentioned to you last time we chatted that when I was a student at Harvard Business School, I did a thesis on free trade and the McDonald Royal Commission, and I recommended a guaranteed annual income back in 1988. And so I've been a supporter of your issue for a long period of time, and I hope you success, sir. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you for your work and all the very best.
Thank you. That's our show for tonight. Good night.